Welcome to a special edition of 5 to 5. Welcome to a special edition of 5 to 5. My name is PJ and I like to be one of the pastors of the church, and my partner in crime is not here today. Pastor Mark and Becky are on vacation, but before they left, Pastor Mark and I had a conversation about shooting this video while he was gone. See, we've been having some interesting conversations, Pastor Mark and I. We've shared those conversations with the elders, with the Board of Ministries, with the CE Committee, and also with the worship team, inviting them into a conversation that we've been having that has to do with some really important topics of conversation about where we are as a church today and things that we need to be thinking about in order to take steps as we move forward. And now, as we approach time for a congregational meeting, Pastor Mark and I think it's really important for us to share these same conversations with you as well. So we were talking about how can we best do this, invite you into these conversations and be part of this with you without having it be the entirety of the conversation that we had at the next congregational meeting. Because our conversations with the elders was like 3 hours long, with the CE committee was over 2 hours long, with the board of ministries it was probably about an hour long, and with the worship team that was probably pushing 2.5 hours. So we know that at the congregational level, when we start talking about these kinds of things and inviting you into a conversation, it could take an awful long time. So Pastor Mark had the idea of me shooting this video of the kind of information that we wanted to share with you at the congregational meeting before we open up the floor for any questions or feedback. So it would free up time during our congregational meeting. And we're asking each and every person in our church, particularly those who are members, to watch this video and to take part in a survey that will follow the video. And then also, if you have any questions about what we're talking about in this video, you could send those questions to Pastor Mark or myself or any of the elders of the church, and that'll give us an opportunity to prepare to respond to those questions either in an email, another video, or while we're at that congregational meeting. All right? So here's a timeline. We're talking about the different structures that we have here as a church. We're not talking about the building as such, but we're talking about the kind of organizational structures. Whenever you gather a group of people together, you have to have certain things that take place in that organization in order to help that organization function. So it doesn't matter if it's a high school or whether it's a town board or whether it's a government like the United States of America, or it's just your local church. There are leadership responsibilities within that local church, and then there's this structure that guides how those leadership teams operate within the church. And then there's all these things that are happening behind the scenes that you don't really understand that are happening as part of a church. And those structures either open up the opportunities for organizations to grow, or they create a problem where those structures are actually restricting growth from happening within the organization. And we've had multiple conversations, and we know that just about everybody who is part of Auburn Alliance Church would like to see it grow. And one of the things that we've seen is that some of the structures that we have kind of limited the growth that we can have here as a church. Now, we started to have these conversations months ago. Pastor Mark and I, we invited the elders into it, and then we had a little bit of a timeout that took place when we went off to district conference. And when we were at district conference this year, we had a representative from national office who came to speak to the pastors that had gathered together. That person from national office presented a talk to us that talked specifically about churches' size and structure. And I thought it was incredible timing on the Lord to bring a speaker into Pastor Mark and I's life to be able to speak specifically into the kinds of things that we were talking about in our leadership teams. So I took the presentation that the guy from national office presented to us, and I shared that with each of our leadership teams, and that's a presentation that I want to share with you. So the guts of this presentation we received from representative from national office. I got a hold of his PowerPoint slides, and I want to share with you the PowerPoint as I'm going through this. I took what he did and I edited it a little bit and made it appropriate for us as a church. So for the most part, this comes straight from healthy church ministry material that comes from our denomination that I think is really, really important for us as a church to understand. Okay? So here we go. We're looking at a PowerPoint called Church Size and Structure. So if we think about church size and structure, we're going to look at three different categories of church sizes. The first one is a small church, and that's a church of probably up to about 200 people. The second one is a medium-sized church, would probably go from 200 to 400 people, a rough estimate from people size. And then a large church, somewhere over 450, 500 people and up, that each one of those three different sizes of a church requires a different structure. So here I'm going to look at a matrix now that kind of shows you the dynamics of what, kind of like the guts of what each of those different church sizes would look like if we start to look at its structure. The first thing we're going to talk about is orientation. How do we think as a leadership team when we're thinking about churches? The top line there is a small church structure. In a small church, the orientation is very relational. We want everybody to know one another. We want everybody to be part of each other's lives. In fact, did you know that the average size of church in America is 80 adults? And that one of the things that drives that is because most people in church want to know one another. I hear comments all the time in church. There's people in this church I don't know. I don't want the church to get so big that I don't know everybody in the church. And these kinds of things say that we want to be very relational in how we orient our church, where everybody knows one another. Second category is called leadership, right? So the leadership in a small church resides in key families in the church. The kind of pastor that a small church hires is a lover. Because of that relational orientation, they want a pastor who's going to love people. A pastor who spends a lot of time sitting in people's living rooms, a lot of time hanging out with people's families. How are decisions made in a small church? Well, they're pretty much made by the congregation, and they're driven by history. When you're making a decision in a small church, a lot of times you hear, well, this is what we did 20 years ago. This is what we did when so-and-so was the pastor of this church. Where we're trying to make decisions to move forward, our first place of looking is in the past. That's a sign that we're a small church. And that's kind of how small churches operate. What kind of staff does a small church have? Well, they typically have one pastor, or they might have a pastor who works part-time in the church and part-time outside of the church. And when we're looking for a church to change, that change usually takes place from the bottom up through those key families within the church. So that's the dynamics of what a small church looks like. A medium-sized church, you can see how things change a little bit. The orientation of the church starts to be more programmatic. You start talking about relational, everybody knowing one another. Now we start to talk about the programs of the church, where we maintain programs in order to meet the spiritual needs of each and every person who is coming into the church. That's a medium-sized church mentality. We need to have enough programs in order to keep enough people occupied within the church so that we're helping them develop spiritual formation. How does the leadership work in a medium-sized church? Well, it happens through committees. It's not possible for everybody to know everything going on in a church in a medium-sized church. It'd be like impossible for us to communicate everything that's going on in the life of the church to everybody. So you have to divide up into committees, where this committee takes care of this thing, and this committee takes care of that thing, and this committee takes care of the other thing. And then the church congregation has to trust the committees to do the work that you've assigned them to do. What kind of pastor do you hire? Well, you hire someone who's an administrator. This is someone who's got to be able to manage all of the committees that are taking place within the church. Decisions here are made by the committees, and they're driven by the changing needs. So you get together with a committee meeting and you find out that we have a need for our kids ministry because we don't have enough adults to be able to help out because we just got 10 new kids coming in the pre-K program. Well, that's an issue. That's a problem. That's a need for change. So the change is going to happen in order to meet the need that's identified through the committee that has oversight over that particular area of the church. The whole church isn't going to know about that need for change, but just that committee is going to know about it, and then they're going to be empowered to be able to make those changes. What kind of staff are you looking for here? Well, you need maybe a couple pastors on staff, or I've been part of churches that had multiple part-time ministry leaders on staff. We had a part-time children's ministry leader and a youth pastor, a part-time worship leader, a part-time men's ministry leader. And now you're looking at multiple staff positions in order to help manage all of the committee work that's taking place so that we can do the programs to be able to meet the needs of everybody that's coming to the church. In this church structure, how does change happen? Well, it happens from the middle out through those committees. Those committees are the ones that are initiating the change and making it happen within the church. So those are some of the dynamics of a medium-sized church. Now, if we open up the door for a large church, we start to see the orientation is organizational, where you start to think about how is the whole church going to be working as a whole. Not those individual committees doing their things, but it's overarching. The overarching ministry leadership of the church, leading the committees or ministry leaders, and they're taking care of all the programs and the people in the church. Leadership resides in select leaders who have oversight over each of those different ministries of the church. You could have a huge ministry to young adults in a church like this, where you could have 200 young adults come into this ministry, and they may or may not come to worship on a Sunday morning in that church. So that whole young adult ministry might be doing their own thing because that's the thing that's happening within the culture and what's happening in the lives of those young adults. And you got to be okay with saying, well, that's part of our church too, even though we don't see them all the time, because they're with us in our organization. They're part of us, even if they're not with us all the time that we're gathering. What kind of pastor does this church need? Well, this church needs a leader for a pastor, someone who's a visionary leader, always thinking about what's happening and the next things ahead of us. How are decisions made? Well, they're made by the staff and the leaders over these different organizational areas of the church, and it's driven by vision. Not how do we used to do things, not what are the problems that we have today, but thinking ahead to where do we want to be in a year from now or 2 years from now or 5 years from now. And we're always thinking about vision. Here we must have multiple staff positions to oversee all those different areas of the church. And change takes place from the top down through those key leaders as they are leading over their own individual ministries of the church. So there's a look at the different ways the churches are operating and the different ways the churches are structured. And as I've been giving this presentation of those different groups, one of the questions they asked is, where do I think we stand as a church, you know? And I think we as a church, we have a foot kind of in the small church mentality, and we have a church in the medium-sized church mentality. I see that specifically for the orientation, where we do have programs that are going on in our church, and some of those programs are healthy and vibrant and are bigger than they should be for a church our size. Other programs are very small, and I do hear people say all the time, one of the biggest complaints about our church is they can't know everybody that's there. Particularly when we went to two Sunday morning worship services, people said, I haven't seen so-and-so in a long time. How are they doing? And I'm like, oh yeah, they come to the first service or they come to the second service. So you kind of have to be okay with not being able to see everybody in the church or know everybody in the church. And I think Auburn Alliance Church right now has 1 foot in our small church as far as our orientation goes, and 1 foot in our medium-sized church. As far as our leadership goes, I think we're mostly a small church in our leadership. We do have committees, but we keep going to the congregational meetings in order to have decisions being made. So that shows we trend towards the small group and how we're trying to make decisions. You have 2 different pastors in your church. One of them is a lover. Pastor Mark loves people. People love Pastor Mark. I am not a lover as a pastor. I'm a visionary leader. That's the kind of pastor I am. And I think it's really interesting that we have one pastor in a small church mentality and one pastor in a large church mentality. And one of the best things about my relationship with Pastor Mark is that he's okay with that. And I'm okay with Pastor Mark being a lover as a pastor. And what's really neat is Pastor Mark and I talk about this. There are people in the church who will call Pastor Mark and have a conversation with Pastor Mark about deep, incredible things going on in their life. And he'll come to me and he'll say, hey, PJ, by the way, did so-and-so talk to you about something going on in their life? I'm like, nope, they didn't talk to me at all. And they're like, well, I just kind of give you a heads up as to what's going on. And I'm like, great, I'm glad that you are the one that they're talking to. I'm glad you're the one that they're counseling with. And I just give you thumbs up to be the one to meet with them and help them in those ways. And then we get to presentations like this, where we talk about structure of the church and vision for the church and the future for the church. And Pastor Mark hands me the microphone and says, PJ, why don't you talk about this? Because this is what I love to talk about. This is my language. If I had a PhD in ministry, this is what I would have a PhD in, because I love this. God's wired me to think about these things and understand these things in the church. And Pastor Mark loves handing me the microphone and says, PJ, it's your turn. Why don't you explain this stuff to us? And the two of us working together as a team are able for us as a church to be able to step in the small church mentality, in the medium-sized church mentality, two of us working together, and in the larger church mentality as we start to think about what the vision for our future looks like. Now, as far as decisions in our church, I think we're primarily making them as a small church, where we're thinking a lot of things about the past. And I want to tell you that in our leadership conversations, we've been talking an awful lot more about the future than we have been talking about the past. But one of the problems that we have in our church is we have to let go of the past decision-making, small church mentality in order to truly step into that future that we would like to see happen as a church. Too many times I've seen us move forward, trying to move into the future, and then families in our church pull us back to the way we used to do things in the past. So we want to talk about that in our congregational meeting and say, this is a change that we need to make in our church to help allow us to step into the future and be able to see our church grow in size, grow in spiritual growth, reach people who have never known Jesus before. In order to do that, we have to change some of the ways that we're doing these things in our church, change the structures and how we think about leadership. We talked about staff already with 2 people on staff and many qualified volunteers in our church. I so appreciate the hours people spend in leadership in our church. And change happens bottom up through key people. If certain people in our church say no to a decision, then that decision is gone. It's not going to happen. No matter how much the committee has done the work, no matter how much the visionary leadership team does their work, there's a few people in our church who could say no to a decision and it's done. There's other people who say, you got to do it this way. And then all of a sudden people say, okay, we got to do it this way because so-and-so said we got to do it this way. So I think that's a point of change that we need to address in our church too. How can we hand that decision-making responsibility into people who are in committees or into those ministry leaders? One of the best ways that we could do that, by the way, is to have those key people in our congregation serving on those committees or being the ministry leaders in those areas of ministry. But for the most part now, the people who are decision makers in our church are not on those committees and they're not serving in leadership positions. So that's a point that we are going to be talking about. So let's think about this a little bit different way. All right, so we're going to talk about a metaphor, which is another way to describe things. We think about the small church. The metaphor that we use is small church is a family, right? The leader functions as the head of the family. A loving pastor is going to care for the people that are in the church and treat them like they're part of his family. And everybody who comes to the church feels like they're part of a family, the family of God, which is great. It's awesome for this to be happening in the church. Every family has other influential members who must be consulted when decisions are made. So, there's small churches where the pastor says, this is what we're going to do, and other people in the church say, no, we're not going to do that. And I've even heard some people say in church situations that the pastors come and go. So all we got to do is wait out the changes this pastor is bringing, and when he leaves, we'll just go back to the way we used to do things before. Well, that's a sign that those key families are the number one influencers in the church, and the pastor is just trying to get his foot in the door in order to have influence there. In this kind of a church setting, small church family milestones are celebrated. I was part of a church who once a month we had a potluck dinner, and that potluck dinner was designed to celebrate all the birthdays for the month. So everybody that had a birthday would stand up and say something about what's going on in their life, and then we'd all sing happy birthday to these people. And that happened every month of the year because we wanted to celebrate birthdays for everybody that was going on in the church. So you can see this is a small church. Now, again, I'm going to remind you, there's nothing wrong with a church size. Small churches have their place. They can be healthy and vibrant and great hands of the kingdom for the Lord. There can be medium-sized churches that are great, doing amazing things for the kingdom of God. And there's large churches that can be doing great things, but there can be small churches that are unhealthy. And there can be medium-sized churches who are unhealthy. And there can be large churches who are unhealthy. So we want to focus on being a healthy church that God is blessing and using, and we let him decide how many people are going to be here with us. So then the metaphor for the medium-sized church is that it's an organism where the leader functions as the hub of the organism or the manager of all of the different aspects of what's going on, aligning those different subsystems or programs. The church is highly responsive to its environment. Because it's an organism that's alive and moving, it can adapt and it can change. where we have 50 kids in our youth group. Well, we got to put a lot of time and attention into the youth group because there's all these kids that are here. Or we don't have enough kids in the kids ministry, so now we're going to put a lot of time and attention into the kids ministry so we can build that up. Or maybe we have a lot of people who are older in the church and they need a Bible study to talk about this, or we need this for young families. We're just adapt to what do we see in front of us that we need to talk about and what we need to do. And a healthy, medium-sized church is always saying, what's the next thing for our church to do? And then as we identify a need, then we launch a new program to be able to help meet that need that we've identified as an important thing that has to happen in our church. So a large church is like a culture. The leader functions as a cultural architect, helping shape and affirm vision and values. And the church shares a strong sense of coherency among its loosely connected members. And that's why you're okay with the youth group you don't know all the kids in the youth group, but you're excited about all these kids that are coming to know Christ and being discipled in the youth group. Or you don't know the young adult ministry or the older adult ministry or the ladies' Bible studies doing this thing and the men's Bible studies doing this thing. And we're okay with all of these different segments of the church operating because we're all part of the same church. And we're excited that God's working in all of these different ways within the church. And the church shares a strong relationship with its community. This is one of the key things for me about having a large church, is that the church is in the community. And because it's in the community, each of these different aspects of ministry within the church can reach the community in different ways. A small church usually only has one avenue of care for its community. They'll pick one kind of a service project within its community. A medium-sized church might have 2 or 3, maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of ways that they're reaching into the community. But a large church could have dozens of different ways to reach into the community. And ideally, a large church is having such an impact on the community starts to say, what would we do if we didn't have that church in our community? And they become dependent upon the people of God within the church and the vision within that church in the community. And I'm a visionary leader, and that's the kind of church I would love to see Auburn Alliance Church become. And that's the direction that I'm helping to steer us so that we could have a huge impact on lost people within our community, and that we as a church could have every single person within our church actively involved in reaching people within our community. Now here's a couple more key points before we move forward. One of the most challenging aspects of organizational growth is that it requires us to change when things are going well. Did you hear that? Organizational growth must change when things are going well. Otherwise, you become a reactionary change agent where there's this big issue that happens. And when that big issue happens, you put all your time and energy into trying to solve that issue or fix that thing that's broken. And you're making decisions behind the curve, and you're not able to truly make changes that are effective, where you're always behind what needs to happen. Or sometimes in this kind of a scenario, the change is happening and then you find out about the change and then you make a decision about that change and it turns out you made the wrong decision. The greatest example for this that I can think of for our area is Kodak. When Kodak was faced, they're a company that makes film, right? So they're faced with this new invention called the digital camera. And Kodak could have gone into digital cameras and start thinking about how they could help people make the transition from cameras with film to cameras without film. And what Kodak's decided to do is they said, this is not going to last. This isn't going to take. We're just going to be an organization that takes care of providing film for people and developing the film for people. And what they totally missed is that culture didn't care about film and their cameras anymore. They went almost completely digital, and now that company is a complete empty shell of who they once were, because they were late to adopt to the change that was happening in our culture. And they gambled, and their gamble lost. So it's important for us to realize, if we at Auburn Alliance Church want to be a healthy, growing, vibrant church, we must make organizational changes before it looks like we need to make those organizational changes. And we make those changes to our organization, and actually opens up the door for us to step into that next category to see the kind of growth that takes place. And trust me on this, I've read on this numerous times, that if an organization is not able to make the changes, then what they're doing is they're actually stifling the growth that could take place in their church, and they're keeping them in that place that they are. If they're a small church, they're never going to get past 150, 200 people. They'll just always keep coming back to 120, 150, growing up to 200 people, and then you're all the way back to 120, 100 people. If you're a medium-sized church, you can never become that culturally impacting church, because you just get up to that place, you hit that barrier, and then you fall back to what you're comfortable to. Instead, you have to be able to make the changes at the right time, and that time is when things are going well. Between each stage of organizational growth is a period of change where an organization must transition from one phase to the next, or they will see their development arrested. Again, if you're not able to make those adaptations, the structures that you have in place in your church are going to dictate the number of people that you can possibly accommodate. And if you're not willing, when the church grows, to make the right kind of change, it's just going to go right back to the normal size of what your structure can accommodate. The best story that I have to illustrate this for you is a friend of mine who was part of a church plant. He was planting a church in a tiny little space. Think about the size of the fellowship hall, right, here at Auburn Alliance Church. And I know that used to be our sanctuary, and I can't even imagine how in the world we could fit like 200 people sitting in there worshiping on a Sunday morning. But think about a size that size in a church that just starts with 50 people. And they come to church and they feel real comfortable in that kind of size, and the church grows to 100 people and 150 people and 200 people and 250 people. And they're trying to bring everybody together into one room so they could all worship together, operating like they're a small church, thinking that it's not possible to separate that group into two, or it's not possible to go and get to another place. And the leadership team meets together, and they're like, this is so cool. Everybody's so excited. That room is jam-packed. It's standing room only. People are squeezed together, but they're happy about it because God's doing something here, and everything's exciting, and everything's great. And the leadership team says, you know what? We don't need to make any changes. We're not going to split into two services, because then the room would look empty and people wouldn't know each other. And we're not going to try to find another place, because this is like a good place for us. We really like it here. So I think we're just going to keep operating under this until we get 300 people who are part of our church. Well, they made a huge mistake in making that kind of a decision, because within 6 months, the coolness of having that many people cracked into the room just wore off. And one by one, the people said, I'm not coming to this church anymore. I can't cram into this church. If the leadership isn't going to make changes so that it's not so uncomfortable in there for worship, well, then I got to go find somewhere else to worship, because I can't keep doing this over and over and over again. It was fun for a little while, but that fun wore off. And what really happened in that church is a year later, they only had 50 people in their church. They went right back down to a small church, because that's what their structure was designed for. Same kind of thing could happen to us, where we get a movement. God brings people into our church, and if we're not ready to adapt to the growth that takes place in our church, if we don't make the structural changes that are required to accommodate that, then we're going to go right back to the size of church that our structures can handle. Let me explain it to you a different way. This way to explain the stages of the life of a church comes from a book called Historical Drift. And this book outlines really well, by the way, how over time, every organization, whether it be a business or a club or a church, they drift away from their original vision when they started the church. And you have to just continue to remind yourself of what the important things are, and then make adaptations within the organization in order to allow for the changes of growth that takes place. Or you're just going to fizzle and die. That's kind of what happens. There's so few organizations that last more than 100 years, because they're not willing or able to be able to make the kinds of changes. So look at this life cycle of a church. By the way, that egg-shaped arc really should be a bell curve, but this is the limit of my artistic ability, so I apologize for that. So you start out with dreams. This is what we could be as a church. That we're going to be so excited about these kinds of things as a church, and those dreams start to become infectious, and other people want to join in on how exciting those dreams sound, and then those dreams try to create a system of beliefs, and those beliefs are designed that you're going to believe that these dreams can come true. And when you start to do that, you set goals in order to help you be able to accommodate making those dreams come true. When those goals are being set and you're operating within them, well, then you start to create structure. So if we dream about a church with 100 people in it, and 100 people start showing up, we start to say, what are we going to do with all these people now that they're here? So we start to create a structure in order to disciple those 100 people, to care for those people, keep track of all those people, communicate with those people. And now we have that structure going where we have a kids ministry and a youth ministry and small groups and a Sunday morning service and a worship team, and all that stuff's going really well. We get to the top of that bell curve, which is where everything is going well. Now, usually when we get to that place where everything's going well, we kind of cross our arms and we kick back a little bit and we take a breather because, man, it's been a lot of work to dream. It's been a lot of work to develop these beliefs and these goals and to develop this structure so that we can actually operate the way we want to do as a church. But the problem is, as soon as you take your foot off the gas pedal and you start to coast, without even realizing it, you come down the downside, the unhealthy side of church life. And then you start to have nostalgia, where people start to say, you know what? Things aren't going as well as they were a year ago. We should go back and do things this way. Or people are like, 20 years ago, we experienced this as a church. We need to go back and do them the way we used to do 20 years ago. And now we start to think about how things used to be. Instead of thinking ahead of how things can be, we start to look in the rearview mirror a lot more often, which leads to questioning. Well, how come things aren't going well? And how come we can't do things the way we used to do them? Or they start questioning who the leader is and who the leader should be. And all of a sudden, all of this time and energy, which could be put into helping the church grow, is put into just kind of looking at what's going on and pointing fingers at each other. And it just really leads to confusion. And that questioning leads to a polarization, where now people start to team up. Where this group of people thinks this should happen, and this group of people thinks that should happen, and this group of people thinks we should do something completely different. And then you start having people over in your living room to be able to meet together with them and say, don't you agree with me? I want you on my team. We're going to go and talk to the elders and present that there's 30 people who think we should be doing the things this way. And all of a sudden you got teams that are polarized. The church is just all of these different groups of people who think these different things. And with all those people on their teams, they're starting to think that the number of people that they have should speak into the seriousness of this matter. This is where church splits happen at this point, where there's enough people who believe something, the leadership won't respond to it, and then they say, we're just going to go worship together. We're going to do our own thing. A small group who breaks apart from the church, or a group of people who want things happen their way are going to break apart from the church, and now they're going to go do their own thing. Statistically, that just doesn't last very long, because when you start something new based upon anger, it doesn't last very long. It has to be done through the vision and leading of the Holy Spirit in order for it to last, if it's something that's part of the kingdom of God. And then what happens, the last one is dropout, where all of a sudden, people are leaving the church because you're not doing it this way, you're not doing it that way, or all those kinds of things. So you see, every organization starts to go through this kind of a cycle. Every organization starts to fall into these different categories. And I've been part of many churches in my life, and I've seen where churches are in this life cycle, and I've watched this life cycle happen over and over and over again. Now I want to tell you that the most healthy response to this is right about where you develop structure, right about where you start to do ministry well. As soon as you feel like you're going to take your foot off the gas pedal and you're going to put your arms, cross your arms and lean back and take a break because everything's going really well, that's when you need to start to cast new vision. That's when you need to start all over again. And when you do start all over again for a period of time, that bell curve goes down a little bit. And it looks like you're taking a step backwards because you have confusion. And that confusion starts to bring about some dreams, and it starts to bring about some beliefs, and then it starts to bring about some goals, and then some structure, and then all of a sudden the church is moving forward again, and things are excited. People are excited about the kinds of things that are happening again. And a healthy organization goes through this cycle over and over and over again. As soon as things start going well, you start to cast that vision, start to dream about what's the next stage that we have for a church. So these are conversations that we've been having, Pastor Mark and I, with the elders of the church, with the other leadership teams of the church, talking about how important it is for us to think about Auburn Alliance Church structurally. Do we have the kind of structure that's going to allow our church to grow? How big of a church do we want to have as Auburn Alliance Church? There's nothing wrong with saying we want to stay as a small church, but then all of our conversations and leadership should be focused on how to be the best small church we can possibly be. If we want to be a medium-sized church, or if we want to be a large church, well then our conversations in our leadership teams should be based upon that dynamic of leadership required in order to fulfill that kind of a church ministry. And then we have to let go of the old. If we want to be a medium-sized church, we have to let go of the ways of doing things in a small church mentality. And we have to embrace the way to do things in medium-sized churches. When we're a medium-sized church, because we're kind of halfway between those two, if we're a medium-sized church and we want to become a larger church, well, we have to take that step again. And we have to step into becoming that larger size of a church. We really want to be a medium-sized church right now. We as a leadership team, we want to step into that medium-sized church. We want to see committees have the power to be able to make decisions. We want to see ministries growing each and every area of the church. We want to see a healthy kids ministry and a healthy youth ministry and a healthy small group ministry. We want to see people who are of all ages within our church finding a place that they can come for those three things that we talk about in our Links class. For us all to worship together on a Sunday morning. For us to have a place that we can come to learn. For those of you who are teenagers, that's youth group. If you're children, that's a kids ministry. If you're an adult, we want you to be part of a small group. That's the number one place that you can come to be able to learn. Wouldn't it be great if we had half the adults of our church operating within a small group that was just for them? And then the third thing is we want you to have a place to serve. Not coming to church just for me, but coming to church to be able to care for others as well. Now, in the midst of these conversations that we've been having about structure and size and vision that we have for our church, we've really been talking about how there's a missing age group within our church. Now, I know that they're there, but they're not stepping up into the primary spotlight as much as we really like them to be, and they're not with us as often as we would like them to be. And that group is from graduating high school through like the 30s. So people who are in their older teens, people in their 20s, and people who are in their 30s. These are mostly people in our church demographics who are kind of falling through the cracks. These are people who are not participating in all of the different ministries that we're having. And they're people who aren't attending church as often as we'd really like to see attend church. And we've started to reach out to people in that age category, and we started to talk with them about some of the reasons why they might not think Auburn Alliance Church is meeting their spiritual needs during this time. And we think that's a really important thing for us to do. The other group that we'd really like to reach are people who have young families. We really like to have a healthy, vibrant, exciting kids ministry in our church. Our youth ministry is outstanding. We have more students than a church our size should have. There's times where we have 40 kids here coming to youth group on a Sunday night. It's amazing. It's huge. They're bouncing off the wall, tons of activity and all kinds of excitement taking place. And that's really amazing. And we'd love to see 40 to 50 kids taking, part of a kids ministry within our church as well. But we just don't have that many kids that are here. And we as elders have been meeting to talk about these things. And one of the things that we've identified as elders is we don't have the solutions to how to solve these problems that we have. Of how do we engage the 20s and 30s in our church and incorporate them into all the different ministries that are taking place in our church better than we are now. We so appreciate all the 20s and 30s who are part of our church, but we know that there's a lot of them on the sidelines, and we'd like to see them get in the game as well. And then we also realize that our community, that it's a great place for us to be reaching into our community, to reach young families, people who are in their 20s and 30s, people who have young kids, people who have kids in their youth group age. We want to reach them and bring them into the church because they need Jesus too, and they need to be discipled, and they need to be cared for, and they need to be taught. And right now we just don't see that happening in our church. And we as elders would really like to see that change. And we know that we can't figure out how to make those changes. We could put a lot of time and effort into doing something, but if we do something and then they don't show up for those ministries, we think that's going to be a waste of time. So what we're going to be doing here in the end of August is we're going to be hosting a series of focus groups where we're inviting people who fall in those two categories. Whether you're in your graduating high school in your early or late teens to your 20s or your 30s, we want you to be in focus groups where we start to ask you what are the things that we could do as a church to be a better care for your spiritual needs. And the second thing we want to do is invite those who have young kids to be able to be part of those focus groups so that we can ask them, what can we as a church do better to care for the needs of your church? A few months ago, Jeff Quinn was with us for a training seminar. And during that training seminar, we did we pulled together all of the current leaders of our church. If you were a ministry leader, if you were on a board of the church, you were invited to this meeting that we had where we talked about some leadership kinds of things. And one of the biggest things that we noticed in that group of people that we gathered together is that almost all of them were over 50. Almost all of the leaders of our church are over 50. That was a tough thing to see. We don't invite the 20-year-olds into the leadership circles and the 30-year-olds into the leadership circles as often as we should. And somehow we've got a disconnect of being able to invite those people to come and be part of our leadership teams. Now, I got to tell you, if you're not part of Elevate, Elevate addresses this. We've been talking about this for a year and a half now in Elevate, how we can create a culture of discipleship whereby people are reached for the Lord, and then they're built into stronger believers, and then they're equipped to be workers within the kingdom, and then they're multiplied as leaders, and then they're sent as leaders within our ministries or other places. And that we could create an environment whereby kids graduate from high school, and then as young adults, they're brought into this discipleship culture, this cycle where they're going to be reached and built and equipped and multiplied and then sent as leaders. And we could be creating this leadership factory whereby we're making leaders right here within our own midst, instead of hoping that a young family that's already been trained moves into our town and is liking our church better than the others in town, or someone who moves from another church in town because they don't like something happening there, and then they come into our church. Well, that's not healthy church reaching out to other people. We're not trying to pull people from other churches into our church. No, we wouldn't do that. We want to reach people who don't know Jesus. We want to take the people that God's put in our church and better equip them to be able to be trained as leaders within our church. And we haven't done a great job of that. And we need to do a better job of that. So we are going to be meeting together with that demographic in our church, and we're going to ask them for their thoughts and their opinions on how we could do better in order to care for them and to teach them and to bring them into those leadership circles. And then we as elders and a board and CE committee and other ministry leaders within the church, we're going to be taking all the information that we gather in those focus groups, and we're going to prayerfully strategize what we do with that information in order to help create an environment and a space for that demographic to fit into our church. So you might fall into that demographic. This might be your first notice. We want you to be part of the focus groups. You might have part of that demographics in your family, and you just need to tell them, we want them to be part of that focus group. We really, really want to hear what your opinion is. And we're not just doing a survey to try to hear things from afar. We want to pull people into a room so that we can hear what they have to say, and that they can hear what we have to say, and that they can hear what each other has to say. And we have a survey tool that's going to work really well so that they don't have to be afraid if they're shy. We still are going to have an opportunity for them to be able to hear their opinions and be able to engage with them. So these are really, really, really important things that we've been talking about in the last year or so in the leadership teams in our church. And we wanted to share that with you. We think some changes need to happen in the structures of our church to allow our church to grow. And we think it's really important for us to figure out what's going on in the lives of young people in our church, the 20s and the 30s, and those that have kids in our ministries, so that we can make some changes to better care for that group. And then once we better care for that group, we're going to be better prepared to be able to reach into that demographic in our area and be able to see young people in our community, in their 20s, come to know Jesus and be brought into the church. We're going to be able to see young families with little kids and teenagers and moms and dads be reached for the gospel and brought into our church, and we're going to have a place to plug them in. And we as a church are going to be excited about caring for them and loving them and discipling them the way God is calling us to do that. So, a lot of information, a lot of material. I understand that. What we'd love for you to do is we'd love for you to take a survey now to be able to give you a little bit of feedback based upon what we've been talking about. And then number two, we open up the door for you to communicate with us. Will you please send us your text messages or your Facebook messages or your emails? You can write letters and send them in the mail. You can knock on our door and say you'd like to talk with myself or Pastor Mark or any of the elders of the church, because we'd love to talk with you about these things. The reason we want to talk to you about these things is because we need you to be on mission with us. We need you to understand where we're trying to head as we change the structures of our church so that we can accommodate church growth. We need you to understand why we're trying to change ministries of our church so that we can reach into our community to care for young people more, to care for them better, to be able to see more people come to know Jesus and then be brought in and be discipled and trained in leadership positions. And we need you to do that. If you're watching this video and you're more than 50 years old, guess what? It is your turn to step up and say, I need to care about the young people in my church. And some of you do, and I know you do, and I appreciate that you do. But we need to do this together as a team better than we have, and we need to be more intentional on it. If churches don't care about the younger people in the church, they're only one generation away from not even existing as a church anymore. And I'm not ringing the warning bell really loudly yet, but I'm letting people know that there's a warning bell that will be rung in the near future if we don't make some changes in our church. Because if we lose young families in our church, statistically, we'll never get them back again. And then we as a church will continue to age. That leadership team's all over 50 now. In a few years, it'll all be over 60. In a few years, it'll all be over 70. And then the church is going to die when we die in our 70s and 80s. So we really need to care about young people. We need to care about young families. This needs to be a very important thing for us to care about as a church. So let me pray for us. And again, thank you for watching this video. Father, we at Auburn Alliance Church realize that this is your church. We are your people. We are here because of you. We are here to worship you. We are here to follow you. We are here to develop a church that does all that you want it to do. And I thank you for the history of our church. I thank you for the men and women and teenagers and children who have been part of this church over the many, many, many years that it has existed. I thank you for the way that you have used us as a church to reach people for your kingdom, to be able to bring them in and build them into solid men and women of faith, and then have been able to reach out and care for other people within our community. And I thank you that we stand on the shoulders of all of those people who have done those things. But we know that in every generation, God, you call us to do different things, and you call us to reach people in different ways. Your truth remains the same, but the way that we communicate that truth needs to change because the world is changing. And we ask for your wisdom. We ask for your discernment. We ask for your guidance, O Lord God, to show us the right changes for us to make, to show us the right direction for us to go, to show us, Lord, what we need to do to be right where you want us to be. And if we are right where you want us to be, will you show us that? And if we need to make changes, will you show us that? We want you to be the one who leads us, just like you led Israel by a cloud by day and fire by night. We want you to lead us in this process so clearly that we know that you are leading us, Lord. So again, I thank you for the people of our church. I thank you for the history of our church. I thank you, Lord, that you are stirring in us a vision and a desire to reach our community like never before. I pray, Lord, that as we respond to this desire that you are growing in us, Lord, as leaders within our church, God, that this desire and this vision would be caught by more and more people in our church, that we would just be so excited about the days ahead that you have for us, Lord God. And as we make steps intentional to move in that direction, Lord, may they be steps ordered by you and guided by you. May we waste no time in this process, but that we would follow you completely where you are going to lead us. We love you. We thank you for these things as we pray them in your name. Amen. Amen. Well, thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And please, will you please take 15 minutes to fill out the survey and tell us what you think about this. And if you have any questions or concerns, talk with us. And we look forward to seeing you on that meeting on the 24th.